Good afternoon, everyone, or as they say where I come from, g'day mate. I hope you've been doing well so far today. It's funny listening to the speakers so far this morning and this afternoon because my argument or my thesis in the short amount of time we have together is that the fundamental skill or the fundamental capability to be successful in ICT in the 21st century is certainly not the ability to manage change or the ability to identify change or the ability to kind of see changes happening. I actually think it's emerging that the fundamental skill to be successful in ICT, whether it be as a business leader, whether it be as a bureaucrat or politician driving the ICT agenda, whether it be as academics kind of theorizing ICT, the fundamental skill is actually the ability to deliberately and proactively create behavior change, to change the way people think, act, and buy. Let me give you an example of what I mean. In 1982, General Motors Corporation was in the middle of just one of the most challenging times in the history of the automotive industry. Basically, what was happening in the early 1980s is that mid-market Japanese imports were destroying American automotive manufacturers, right? So car makers in America were just being walloped by Japanese imports. And of all the plants in the General Motors family, the factory in a town called Fremont in Northern California was the worst performing factory. Now, when I say worst performing, it was really bad. Things had gotten so bad at the Fremont plant that on any given day, 25% of staff just wouldn't show up to work. Imagine trying to do your job with a quarter of your workforce not showing up. And the people who did turn up to work were not productive people. In fact, they started playing jokes on customers. This is how disengaged they were. So their favorite joke was they would take lids off Coke bottles and they'd put them inside the door of a car before they bolted the door together. So they'd put Coke lids inside the door. So a customer would test drive the car and they'd be like, what's that noise? There's something. It's the Coke bottles inside the door that staff put there just to annoy you, right? So that's a bad workplace culture, which I think is potentially an understatement. So in 1982, in the midst of all this challenge, the most unlikely business partnership emerged. General Motors approached Toyota, who were the ones responsible for the damage they were feeling. And they went to Toyota and they said, we would like you to take over the plant in Fremont. We've heard about all this amazing stuff you're doing, you know, Toyota production system and lean manufacturing. We've heard about all this amazing stuff. We want you to take over the plant. We still want you to make General Motors cars. We still want you to put them onto the market under our name, but we'll split the profits. We just want to see how you do things. So they closed the factory in 1982. They sent the entire workforce from America to Japan to train for 2 years in the Japanese way of doing business. And then they reopened the plant in 1984. Within 1 year of the plant being opened in 1984, the Fremont plant had gone from the worst performing factory in General Motors to the best performing factory in General Motors. Staff being absent dropped from 25% to 4%, and it stayed as the most profitable plant until 2010, right? So what a profound example of the power of being able to shift the way people behave. I mean, if you look at the topics on the agenda today, mobility, cloud computing, social media, moving up the value chain, these issues facing IT, I think we've got the conversation backwards, because we talk about them like they're changes that are out there happening to us. We need to start thinking about them as changes that we as leaders can deliberately direct and engineer. And I would put it to you, I would argue that this is actually the fundamental competency for leaders in ICT, to be able to change the way people think, act, and buy. So I'm here today because at ChangeLabs, that's exactly what we do. So I started a business about 6 years ago, and we've now got around 80 or so people across North America and Australia and New Zealand. And we build programs that are designed to create behavior change. And so in the short time that I have together today, I've been basically asked to share what I think are the two most useful things that we could take away and put into practice in the organizations that we work in and the organizations that we run that can help us move beyond change management and into creating positive behavior change in what we do. So I'm going to share two things basically today. Firstly, is I want to share the latest research and insight into how exactly humans make the decisions that we make every day. I mean, we have this theory in our head of why we do the things we do and what drives our behavior. And the theories that we have in our head turn out frequently to be quite off the mark and quite wrong. And as a result, we build programs that we think will have a positive impact, that we think will change the way people use technology, but they wind up either not working or, at worst, creating the opposite effect to what we wanted to have. So I want to share a model of the four ways, the four drivers of human behavior. And then I want to use that to move into the second part of what we're going to talk about, which is 3 or 4 observations around how IT businesses and IT organizations and IT departments and structures can create the sorts of change that we want to create. So let's start with this. There's the latest research into why we behave the way we do and why we make the decisions that we make shed some fascinating insight on how wrong we've been for so many years about why we do things. So I want you to imagine a triangle for a second. And it's divided into 4 layers. And they're the 4 different categories of things that drive human behavior. At the very top, you've got the traditional way we think about human beings, right? What I'd call rational drivers. And for a long time, and if you ask any economist out there, they're going to tell you that the way we make decisions is rational. That the old term is a homus economicus, the rational man. That we weigh up costs and benefits, we draw a list of pros and cons, and we're going to undertake behaviors that we think maximize our own utility in the world. But anyone who's ever been shopping would sympathize with the fact that that's really not how people make decisions. In fact, the latest research would suggest that rationality accounts for a tiny part of 1% of human behavior. It's the other 3 drivers that account for most of how we behave. So driver number 1 is rationality, but driver number 2 is something I'd call identity. And there's 2 really quick examples I want to share of this. There was a piece of research done in New Zealand, which many people think is a state of Australia. Most people in Australia think New Zealand is a state of Australia, but apparently they're independent. There was a survey done in New Zealand that was looking at why young men weren't entering trades. So they didn't want to become plumbers, they didn't want to become construction workers or carpenters, and people were wondering why were they not getting into those fields of work. And you'd think that it would be the pay's not good, it's manual labor, it's dirty work. You'd think these would be the reasons. But the number 1 reason that was found when people went to young New Zealand males and asked, why don't you want to be in trades? The number 1 reason, you're going to love this, was that they thought it would be hard to get a date with girls if they told people that they worked in primary trades. So that is the story that went with it, the identity that came with it was so unattractive that they were making life career decisions around the identity that was there. And the evidence the theory behind this is called social identity theory. And it posits that when you get up in the morning and you look in the mirror, we're all asking ourselves 3 questions. 4 if you've had a big party night the night before, but generally we're asking ourselves 3 questions when we get up and look in the mirror in the morning. Question number 1 is, how do I see myself? Question number 2 is, how do others see me? And question number 3 is, how would I like to be seen? And that identity-driven behavior, identity behavior, is about closing that gap between how I see myself and how I'd like other people to see me. There's a famous quote, and I know that, you know, the motorcycles, Harley Davidson, I know they sell to a slightly different demographic here than they do in the United States, but the chief operating officer of the company Harley Davidson that make motorcycles, obviously, was once asked, what is it like to be in the motorcycle business? And his answer was, actually, even though we make motorcycles, that's not what we sell. We don't sell motorcycles. And the interviewer was like, what do you mean? Of course you sell motorcycles. That's what you do. And he said, no. What we sell at Harley Davidson is the ability for a 45-year-old accountant to dress up in black leather, sit on a motorcycle, drive through a small country town, and scare people. That's actually what we sell at Harley Davidson. That is, he was making the point that although the product is what you buy, it's the story and the identity that is really what's driving people's decisions. So you've got rationality, you've got this identity, like what do I think of myself in the world? But the other 2 drivers of human behavior give us some of the most untapped opportunities as leaders to change the way people think, act, and buy. And I mean profoundly change the way. I mean, whether it's we're trying to get our staff to act differently, our customers to use technology differently, our salespeople to have different conversations with customers. These next 2 layers really give us valuable ideas into how we can make those changes happen. Because the 3rd driver of human behavior is structure. So I would just call structure the way the world around us is set up. And it's not conscious. These are unconscious behaviors that are created by the nature of structures. Let me give you a really scary example. It turns out in Australia, doctors don't like washing their hands, which makes me feel really comfortable about my country, right? But apparently, in fact, there was a study done quantifying it. Less than 50% of doctors in Australia in the year 2008, right, so this is recent, less than 50% of doctors were complying with government regulations on hand washing. And so obviously they did a big study into why this was, and they were wondering maybe doctors weren't educated about it, maybe they didn't have the tools, maybe they were too busy. Turns out, no. This is why they weren't washing their hands. When they were with a patient, and so the patient's here and they do their thing, and the door is over there, right? So they finish with the patient and they go to leave. The problem was, the sink and the soap was on the other side of the room, right? So bed's here, exit is over there, soap is over there. And doctors would just go, okay, thank you, I'm done with you now. Should I wash my hands? Oh, it's all the way over there. Don't worry about it. And they'd go this way instead. So the department called Queensland Health moved the soap. Right? This is not rocket science, right? They moved the soap from over here to over here. And instantly, the number of doctors complying with hand washing regulation went from 50% to 95%, just by moving the soap from one side of the room to the other, right? Let me give you an IT example about this. the Australian government just spent $25 billion on buying computers, buying laptops for students in school. It is the single largest per capita technology investment in education ever in the world, right? It is a giant investment in technology. And so we bought a laptop for every child, we put new stuff in it, and lo and behold, a year after, people weren't using laptops in classes. And people would ask, why weren't they doing it? Turns out, there weren't enough power outlets inside classrooms to plug in computers. They'd just kind of forgotten that in the rush to buy a whole load of laptops. That is the structure, even though people wanted to exhibit the behavior. In this case, they wanted to use the technology, but the structure that was in place prohibited the use of the technology. So in both of those examples, whether it's washing hands or plugging computers in, you've got structures dictating the way human beings think, act, and buy. And the last one is habit. So it turns out most of the things we do on a day-to-day basis, we do for no other reason than we did them yesterday. We don't have a better reason than that for most of what we do. So if you really want to change behavior, breaking habit turns out to be one of the most difficult parts of the whole equation. Now, you could spend months and months and months, and often we do spend months and months and months talking about these 4 things. I've just spent 5 minutes talking about those 4 things, so there's a few gaps in there. But what's really important about these is not those 4 drivers. It's the question, so what does that mean for us as a company if we want to change the way people interact? Like, I mean, we do a lot of work with IT, right? And one of the fascinating challenges that a lot of our big enterprise clients are facing at the moment, like your IBMs and your Microsofts, it's the discussion about moving up the value chain. You know, like we want to get out of just selling an individual server or an individual computer, and we want to start having deep strategic conversations with our clients. Trouble is, we have a sales team who aren't used to having those sorts of conversations. They're used to talking about prices and, you know, specifications. So their question is, how do we change the way our sales team are behaving to try and interact with customers in new ways, right? So the real question is, what do these 4 things tell us about how you successfully create change in an organization? In 10 minutes, I want to share 4 different ideas around how we can all become better at creating change in the way other people behave on the basis of these ideas. The first one is we need to be very, very careful about how we use incentives. So typically, the way we try to change people is we put an incentive in place. You know, we put a tax on something to make it more expensive. We set a rule against it and say, if you do this, you're going to be punished. You know, we create incentives. The trouble is, humans aren't particularly rational. So incentives typically don't work very well. In fact, sometimes incentives have completely the opposite effect that you want them to have. The reason I've got the toy truck there is to remind myself of just how bad incentives are, like appeals to people's rationality are in making people change. 2 behavioral economists, a guy called Dan Ariely from MIT and a woman called Sheena Iyengar from Israel, did a study in Israel around childcare. There was a childcare daycare center that was having problem with parents not picking their kids up on time, right? So pretty standard business problem. The trouble was if parents were late, it cost the daycare center loads and loads and loads of money. So they figured they'd basically tax parents. It's worth a try. What they did is they said, for every 15 minutes you are late, we will charge you a fee to be late picking up your kids. So you'd think that would work, right? I mean, that is not, people don't like paying money for stuff. You'd think that would work. Actually, it had the opposite effect to what they wanted to do. In fact, the black line demonstrates a significant rise in the number of people not picking their kids up. People who used to pick their kids up on time stopped picking their kids up on time when they introduced the tax. You just go, what's happening there? Turns out, if you put a price on it, people are like, well, okay, now this is just an economic thing. Now it's got nothing to do with whether I'm a good parent or whether I love my kids. Now it's just I can just pay to do this. So a whole bunch of people started going up. I'll just pay then. It's better than picking the kids up. Like I don't want to spend time with them anyway. Like I'll just pay. You know what's even crazier? When they took the tax away, people still kept picking their kids up late. What had happened is they'd broken the social contract, right? They'd broken the bit that said, I pick my kids up on time because I'm a good parent, and replaced it with a transaction. And in the heart of this, you find the danger of it's the most common approach we see in enterprise is I want my staff to act like this. I'm going to put an economic incentive in place, like a bonus or tie part of their salary package to it or something like that. But the problem is if you're making it an economic incentive, the only thing you incentivize is the exact behavior that has monetary value attached to it. And typically we want people doing more than just that one precise thing. What does work from a rational perspective is removing risks. Turns out one of the greatest things we fear is potential downside or damage or risk to undertaking certain behaviors. The reason I have the HP and the Hyundai logos there is two striking examples, and the second one obviously from the ICT field, about how powerful removing risk can be in changing the way people behave. What Hyundai did during the global financial crisis, obviously people stopped, in the United States in particular, stopped buying cars. I mean, Nissan sales were down 30%, Ford sales were down some crazy percentage. Hyundai put in place a policy that when their nearest competitor was down 11%, Hyundai was up 15%. And what they did is they guaranteed you that if you bought this car and lost your job, we'd give you all your money back. Right? So they basically said a lot of people aren't buying cars because they're worried that they might lose their job, so we'll just guarantee that if you lose your job, up to a certain value, we'll just give you all your money back. They sold 953,700 cars more than they normally would sell when that policy came into place. When you do the maths and you do the numbers and you see how many people lost their job in America at that time, you'd see that there were almost 25,000 people who bought Hyundais who otherwise wouldn't have been able to buy cars because they lost their job. But taking the risk away, removing the risk, completely changed the way people were acting. HP did the same thing with servers. They implemented a policy across Europe that just said, if you install one of our servers in your office and you don't like it for any reason, in the first 9 months we will come to your office, we will take out the server, and we will give you all of your money back. Now the funny thing, obviously, about the server example is who rips out a server after 8 weeks? No one rips out. So the funny thing was, for HP, it drove exactly the behavior they wanted, and there was no economic consequence because no one wanted to take servers out 8 months after they'd installed them. It was a genius little piece of kind of business structure to change the way people were acting. So this is, when it comes to rationality, incentives don't work that well, but removing risk works brilliantly. The second thing we can do that's much, much more powerful than incentives is we can start building an identity around the sorts of behaviors that people want to change. I put this one up. I wanted to use, I don't really have time to use it, so I won't go into it in detail. I really wanted to use the example of safe driving here. After my first experience on Turkish roads yesterday, where I thought I might die 7 or 8 times, I thought it might be really fun to do an example about safe driving. I did some research last night, get a load of this. In 1985, I have to share this. You probably all know this. This was news to me. In 1985, there was a traffic accident every 8 minutes in Turkey. In 1995, there was an accident every 2 minutes in Turkey. By 2005, there was a traffic accident every 52 seconds in this country. And today, there is a traffic accident every 28 seconds in Turkey. Does anyone else, maybe that's where some of the people went. I don't know, but anyway. So it's funny, when you look at the research, this safe driving is one of the key areas where researchers are looking at how you can use identity to change the way people drive. But let me give you an example from ICT rather than safe driving. To harken back to the education policy I was talking about a second ago. So we were doing a lot of work with Apple recently, looking at the way in which educators were using technology. I mean, education in most countries represents a massive potential growth market for ICT. And like I said in Australia, $25 billion of government money on acquiring new technology. But something very, very strange was happening other than the power outlets, right? We would go into schools that had just bought 100 new laptops, and they would all be in their boxes in the office of the IT manager. Teachers weren't using them, and people were scratching their heads going, I don't get it. I don't know why people aren't adopting technology. So we started doing work with teachers, looking at why they weren't adopting, and a fascinating finding emerged. It was all to do with skills and capability, but crucially, the way teachers said why they weren't using laptops was not, I don't have the skills to use them, or I don't know how to do it. What they said was, I am not a technology person. Not I don't have the skills, but I am not a technology, like they were born that way or something, right? That was the way they were talking about it. And when we did this with IBM in businesses, looking at why business leaders weren't adopting social media, it was, I am not a technology person. They were not statements about ability. They were not statements about skill. They were statements about identity. That they'd see all these kids using computers and go, oh, well, that's a kid thing. Like, they'd see kids using mobile phones and go, well, that's a student thing. I'm old, right? But that's for young people. It was an identity statement. And so Apple launched what to this day is still around the world one of the most remarkable corporate IT projects I've seen. They set up a program separate to the Apple brand, right, called Beyond Chalk. And they started going into schools, any schools, not just customers, any schools. They hired, instead of hiring computer experts, they hired education experts. And they went into schools and they'd run workshops with teachers on the power of teaching with technology. Not even schools that were using Windows machines, right? Arch competitors. They'd go, no, we will work with anyone. This is not a sales program. This is a behavior change program. And they hired experts in how to engage students in the classroom of the future. And they literally set about trying to change the way educators saw themselves, their identity in the world with technology. And crazy things started happening. Teachers started proactively going to their students, asking for coaching in how to use computers, right? They'd start engaging outside experts to come in and write teaching with technology lesson plans. And of course, Apple started to get all the credit for changing the face of Australian education and changing the way teachers taught. But to do it, and this is the crucial bit, to do it, they didn't have a technical conversation. They didn't have a skills conversation. They had an identity conversation. And this is why I say I think when ICT has the power to change the world, as it really does, the question for leaders, I don't think in IT, I don't think the question is how might this change the world or how, what change do we need to be ready for? The real question, if we want to seize every possible opportunity that ICT presents, is how can we deliberately create the sorts of behavior change that we want to see. So it's an identity level conversation. And the final point I would make, so you've got removing risk to change behavior. You've got building an identity to change behavior. And I would put it to you that the final one is we can build structures to change behavior. I'm not going to talk about the popcorn thing right now, although turns out, I am going to talk about the popcorn thing. Turns out, if you give people a large tub of popcorn instead of a small one, they will consume 53% more with a large one. 21 more handfuls and 560 additional calories. And in this experiment, no one, even with a small popcorn, no one finished because they finished the box. No one in either group finished their popcorn, but a larger container, you ate 53% or 21 handfuls more popcorn. Again, it's just the structure. Just this. You want to know how to make people eat less? Smaller plates. That'll do it every time. It's the structure that changes the behavior. And in IT, the most powerful structure I think that we have changing the face of the world at the moment is social media. We get engaged to talk about social media a lot, and it's not my topic for today. But I genuinely think, I really genuinely believe, and I think the evidence is beginning to show this, that social media will be as important for the way we communicate as the printing press. In fact, arguably more important than the printing press in the way it's taking power out of the hands of institutions and putting it in the hands of individuals. And when it comes to changing behavior, the funny thing about social media is no one has to ask people to use it. No one had to train 50 million teenagers in how to use Facebook. Like, we didn't have to run an organizational change program to get people to use Twitter. They just used it. And in terms of building a structure that can change the way people behave, the effective deployment of social media is, I think, up there in some of the most powerful tools we can deploy. I have the 1999-2011 reference there just because a phenomenal contrast in disaster relief between the Turkish earthquakes in 1999 and 2011. In 1999, when it was coordinated largely by satellite phone and institutions, versus 2011, where so much of the disaster relief was coordinated peer-to-peer. By one day after the earthquake in 2011, Google had released an app that let people register to find lost families. And 2,000 families had been reunited within the first 48 hours by using this particular social media application. The Red Crescent raised tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars through click-to-donate advertising in social media. There was one Turkish journalist whose name I will completely mispronounce now, but I'm gonna try. Be nice. I think it was Ahmet İzam. Probably that's wrong. Anyway, a Turkish journalist had an idea to start an online group called My House is Your House. And it was offering accommodation to survivors of the earthquake who had lost their house. Within a month, 20,000 individuals had registered to offer, and no one had to ask them to do it. No one had to run a program to get them engaged. The structure being available, just the fact that it existed as a structure drove those sorts of behaviors. So, let me finish by saying two things. Number one, thank you very much indeed. I've been overwhelmed by the hospitality that everyone has shown me the last few days, so thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. And secondly, be really careful about these conversations, about all the changes happening in the world. There are very few changes just happening out there. Someone somewhere, or some groups somewhere, are making those changes happen. And I think for ICT leaders, being able to proactively drive the agenda of creating the sorts of changes we want to see, whether it be in citizens, whether it be in customers, whether it be in staff, that's going to be the skill that will define our success moving forward. So enjoy the rest of the conference, have a fabulous afternoon, and thanks very much for having me across. Cheers.